So back in 1947, the British didn't just, hand over a country.
Right.
They handed over this massive demographic time bomb. And today, we're looking at how a newly liberated nation, one that had been actively, intentionally engineered to divide itself by language and religion for over a century, not only survived that explosive handover, but morphed into the world's most chaotic, functional democracy.
It really is wild to think about.
It is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking the stack of research you provided to give you a clear, no-fluff roadmap of post-independence India.
Yeah, and to even comprehend the modern political and economic engine of India, we really have to establish the baseline of what that first generation of independent leaders actually inherited.
Right, the colonial hangover.
Exactly. Because the British departure wasn't just like a simple change in management. It was the end of this long, deliberate campaign of psychological and social engineering that fundamentally altered the fabric of the subcontinent. I mean, the immediate challenge wasn't just building an army or balancing a budget. It was figuring out how to deprogram a totally fractured society.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this whole strategy of divide and rule wasn't just some vague political concept, right? It was an institutionalized bureaucratic reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
The documents point straight to this British historian named James Mill. Back in 1817, he wrote this massive, highly influential history of India without ever actually visiting the country.
That's just crazy.
Totally. And in that text, he rigidly sliced Indian history into three distinct eras. You have the Hindu era, the Muslim era, and the British era.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer artificial rigidity of that categorization. Because pre-colonial India was this highly fluid place where cultural and religious traditions were constantly overlapping.
Right. It wasn't these neat little boxes.
Exactly. But the British administrative state, I mean, they abhorred fluidity. They needed neat boxes. So they used tools like the decennial census to enforce these hard boundaries.
Just putting everyone in a category?
Yeah, they basically looked at a deeply complex, diverse population and rigidly categorized anyone who wasn't Muslim, Christian, or Parsi into this single monolithic Hindu bloc. And by forcing people to identify with these massive political categories just to, get a job or get representation, the colonial administration planted the institutional seeds of communalism.
Man, it's as if someone handed over the keys to this massive, incredibly diverse house. But right before walking out the door, the previous owner painted these bright, hard lines on the floor, pointing at the roommates and telling them they were fundamentally, irreconcilably different from one another.
That's a perfect analogy.
And then they just drive off, leaving the new residents to figure out how to cook dinner without crossing the lines and starting a war.
Right, and those lines provoked an intense psychological reaction among Indian intellectuals throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The research highlights this deeply complex tension.
Like a push and pull.
Exactly. On one side, you had reformers who embraced Western concepts. Humanism, secularism, scientific rationalism, and they aimed to modernize society from the top down. But that Western influence also sparked a powerful defensive backlash against colonial cultural erasure.
Which triggered massive Orthodox revivalist movement.
Yeah, precisely. Consider the Arya Samaj among Hindus, founded by Swami Dayanand Saraswati, or the Wahhabi and Faridzi movements among Muslims.
These weren't just religious book clubs, were they?
No, not at all. They were active, sometimes militant attempts to purify and revive traditional identities. They functioned as societal defense mechanisms. Their argument was essentially, we don't need Western modernization. Our ancient, pure traditions are superior.
Wow, okay.
And that intense, simmering tension between rapid modernization and deeply embedded Orthodox revivalism, that was the exact societal tightrope that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru found himself walking in 1947.
So Nehru's strategy to stabilize that tightrope was to basically pull incredibly hard from the top. He looked at a poor, fractured nation and decided the state had to become the ultimate parent.
Right. The state is the main driver of everything.
Yeah, we're talking about the famous 5-year plans. He essentially adopted this mixed economy model. He was trying to Frankenstein together the social welfare focus of Soviet-style socialism with the growth engines of Western capitalism.
And the state took absolute control over what they call the commanding heights of the economy. We're talking massive public sector enterprises in heavy industries. Steel, coal, power generation, telecommunications.
Because private wealth just wasn't there.
Exactly. The philosophy was that private wealth in 1947 was too scarce and honestly too selfish to build the massive infrastructure a modern nation required. Only the central government had the capital and the mandate to build dams and power grids on a continental scale.
Right. And to make sure those fragile, brand new domestic industries didn't get crushed by established global conglomerates, the government threw up this massive shield called Import Substitution Industrialization, or ISI.
The tariffs.
Yeah, the mechanics of this are wild. They slapped astronomical tariffs on imported goods. If an Indian factory owner wanted a highly efficient, sleek foreign machine part, the import taxes were so punitive that they were financially forced to buy a clunkier domestic version instead.
Yeah, it deliberately strangled free market competition to force the country to build its own industrial muscle.
And that fierce, almost obsessive desire for self-reliance extended seamlessly into foreign policy, too.
Oh, totally. Nehru became a primary architect of the non-aligned movement. While the globe was aggressively fracturing into the Cold War camps of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, India just refused to sign a loyalty pledge to either.
Which is a bold move back then.
Extremely bold. But by playing both sides and committing to neither, India maintained its strategic autonomy and avoided becoming, a disposable pawn in a superpower proxy war.
But, a highly centralized, top-down economic plan crafted in New Delhi is great in theory, until you try to apply it to those roommates with the lines painted on the floor.
Right, the reality on the ground.
Yeah, how do you govern a population that speaks hundreds of different languages and holds fierce regional loyalties? The central government quickly realized a one-size-fits-all approach was going to literally fracture the nation's borders.
So to maintain national unity, they basically had to embrace decentralization. Following the Fazl Ali Commission in 1953, the government passed the State Reorganization Act in 1956.
And this fundamentally redrew the internal map of India, right, based on linguistics.
Exactly. Instead of just arbitrary administrative zones left over from the British, they deliberately separated groups, like carving out Gujarat and Maharashtra from the massive Bombay state to give Gujarati and Marathi speakers their own political boundaries.
That feels like a massive gamble. Giving subnationalities their own borders could have easily accelerated separatism.
You'd think so, yeah. But the paradox is that acknowledging those linguistic identities actually kept the peace. It served as a vital pressure valve against the unitary, centralizing tendencies of New Delhi.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Creating linguistic states forged this interlocking balance where you could be fiercely proud of your regional language while still buying into the larger national identity.
Except that linguistic formula totally fell apart when they looked at the Northeast.
Yeah, the colonial legacy in the Northeast was entirely unique. The British had left the tribal hill areas largely unadministered. That created a massive cultural and developmental gulf between the plains and the tribal populations.
So you couldn't just draw neat lines based on language there.
No, the demographics were way too complex and the historical isolation was just too deep.
So the central government had to engineer a completely different mechanism. Right. The sixth schedule of the Constitution.
Exactly. They essentially created autonomous district councils, granting local tribal communities wide-ranging legislative and judicial powers over their own land rights, local economy, forests, and customs.
It was a pragmatic admission that integrating vastly diverse regions into a federal union sometimes requires bespoke, highly customized constitutional arrangements.
Precisely.
Okay, so the government manages to redraw the map and keep the borders from collapsing inward. But political unity doesn't mean much if the population is starving.
Yeah, and they were.
Right. By the 1960s, India was facing this existential food crisis, relying heavily on foreign aid just to feed its citizens. That desperation forced the next heavy-handed state intervention, the Green Revolution. Now, wait. We always hear the standard narrative that high-yielding variety seeds and modern agronomy saved India from mass famine, which mathematically is true. But our sources paint a much darker picture of the actual aftermath. Can we talk about the regional disparities?
We definitely should, because the sheer environmental and social cost was staggering. The science behind those high-yielding variety seeds meant they were incredibly thirsty.
They needed a ton of water.
Massive amounts. And chemical fertilizers. In states that adopted this heavily, like Punjab and Haryana, the resulting over-irrigation caused catastrophic groundwater depletion and severe soil salinity.
Wow.
Yeah, they were essentially trading long-term ecological stability for short-term caloric survival.
And the economic fallout was just as severe, right? The benefits of this new technology were aggressively skewed toward large and medium landowners,
Right.
the people who actually had the capital to buy the expensive seeds, the fertilizers, the diesel water pumps.
Right. Small and marginal farmers were completely priced out of this revolution.
So they just got left behind.
Worse than left behind. They were marginalized and ultimately displaced, sparking a massive wave of rural to urban migration. The wealthy landowners accumulated more land and machinery, while the poorer farmers were squeezed into debt or forced to sell out entirely. It massively widened the rural wealth gap.
Which presented a massive ideological problem for a government that still claimed to be socialist-leaning.
Oh, huge problem.
So under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, the central government's response was to forcefully seize the reins of the economy again. If private banks were only lending money to wealthy industrialists and large farmers, the state would just take over the banks.
This was really the peak of state control. The massive nationalization of the Indian banking sector, first in 1969 and then again in 1980, fundamentally altered how capital flowed.
They just forced the money where they wanted it to go.
Exactly. The mechanical goal was to forcefully redirect credit and resources away from urban elites and inject it directly into agriculture, small-scale industries, and rural welfare programs. It was this aggressive reassertion that the state, not the free market, would dictate the distribution of wealth.
But a system that heavily centralized eventually hits a breaking point. I mean, you can only grip the wheel so tightly before the mechanics of the vehicle start to snap.
Right.
And by 1989, the monolithic single-party dominance of the Congress Party effectively collapsed. No single party could secure a majority in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. We enter what the historical data calls the decade of uncertainty.
Yeah, the 90s were wild. And to understand why the political landscape suddenly shattered into dozens of pieces, we have to look at a specific legislative catalyst, which is Mandel politics.
Right, the Mandel Commission.
In August 1990, the government implemented the recommendations of the Mandel Commission. This structurally mandated that a significant percentage, 27% of all government jobs and public sector educational seats, be strictly reserved for the other backward classes, or OBCs.
And the math of that policy completely rewired the electorate. By locking in those quotas, the government essentially mobilized massive, previously underrepresented caste groups into highly organized voting blocs.
It deeply fragmented the national political landscape. Suddenly, you had this rapid proliferation of powerful regional parties whose entire platform was based on representing specific local caste identities or marginalized groups.
So a regional party in, say, Uttar Pradesh or Bihar could now win enough local seats to hold the balance of power in New Delhi.
Exactly. The era of the multi-party system and mandatory coalition governments had officially arrived.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This era of coalition dharma operates exactly like a massive high-stakes group project.
Oh, definitely.
Imagine 30 different regional leaders sitting around a table. The leader from Tamil Nadu only cares about securing infrastructure funds for the South. The leader from West Bengal demands specific agricultural subsidies. Another leader is entirely focused on caste-based job quotas.
Everyone has their own agenda.
Right. They all have fundamentally different ideologies and local voters to please. But if they want to actually run the federal government and access state resources, they are forced to negotiate a common minimum program.
The CMP, yeah.
They have to find the absolute baseline of policies they can all tolerate just to pass a budget.
I mean, it sounds like a recipe for absolute gridlock. And there was profound chaos. Governments collapsed over minor disagreements. And the late 1990s saw frequent, exhausting federal elections.
But they kept moving forward.
They did, because the necessity of that common minimum program forced a pragmatic consensus that actually drove remarkable progress. Because no single ideology could dominate, extreme policies were filtered out in favor of actionable middle ground governance.
Like, look at the track record during this era. The United Front coalition government in the late 90s pushed heavily for rural development and decentralization of power.
Right.
Then, under Atal Bihari Vajpayee's NDA coalition, you had an unwieldy alliance of over 20 different regional parties.
Over 20.
Yeah. Yet that specific government successfully prioritized massive national infrastructure projects and launched the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which was an unprecedented financial commitment to making elementary education universal across the country.
And that trend of pragmatic coalition governance continued under Manmohan Singh's UPA coalition from 2004 to 2014. That decade saw the passing of landmark, rights-based legislation that structurally changed the social contract.
The big one being NRGA.
Yes, NRGA,
Yeah.
which legally guaranteed 100 days of manual wage employment to any rural household, creating this massive economic safety net.
They also passed the Right to Information Act, or RTI. And the mechanics of the RTI completely upended the traditional power dynamic.
It's revolutionary.
It really was. For the first time, a regular citizen could literally demand to see the internal files, budgets, and decision-making processes of a government bureaucrat. It fundamentally altered transparency and accountability in a system previously defined by colonial-era secrecy.
And what becomes clear through the data is that the coalition model, born out of deep political fragmentation and regional self-interest, actually shaped India's integration into the globalized world.
Yeah.
It oversaw a period of steady, highly inclusive economic growth, proving that regional parties could successfully steer the national ship through the necessity of constant, agonizing compromise.
But the mechanics of Indian governance never stay static for long. In 2014, the structure shifted massively again. And just to remind you listening, we're neutrally observing this shift through the data here. But in 2014, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, secured a clear single-party majority in the Lok Sabha.
Right.
For the first time in 25 years, a ruling party didn't have to beg regional coalition partners for permission to pass a bill. Structurally, the pendulum swung hard away from coalition consensus building to highly centralized, streamlined decision-making.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of India's timeline, it demonstrates the cyclical nature of its democracy. A single-party majority allows for rapid, decisive federal action, bypassing the gridlock of that group project we talked about. But in a country as vast and heterogeneous as India, centralization eventually hits the bedrock of regional pride.
Which brings us to the structural reversal in the 2024 elections. The National Democratic Alliance, led by the BJP, returned to power, but specifically required a coalition setup to form the government.
Yeah, and the research suggests this wasn't just a statistical blip. It reflects a core mechanical truth about the subcontinent. Regional aspirations and local identities will always, eventually, assert themselves.
They always come back.
They do. A centralized power structure can only go so far before the distinct linguistic, cultural, and economic needs of the states demand their seat at the negotiating table again.
Yet, through all of this intense political turbulence, the shift from Nehru's protected mixed economy to the chaotic, liberalized coalitions of the 90s, to single-party dominance and back again, there is one constant unifying engine of progress that the historical data points to over and over.
I know where you're going with this.
The Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO.
Yes, it is the ultimate testament to institutional continuity. While the political landscape was constantly fracturing and reforming, ISRO steadily and quietly transformed a developing nation into a top-tier global space player.
It's incredible to think about.
It really is. Whether the budget was being signed by a socialist planner, a fragile United Front coalition, or a single-party majority, the scientific pursuit of space exploration remained a unified national ambition. It operated almost entirely above the messy fray of daily politics.
It proves that underneath the incredibly loud, chaotic surface of Indian democracy, there is this immense capacity for long-term, highly technical execution that transcends regional and ideological divides.
Exactly. Synthesizing the entire timeline, the defining characteristic of post-independence India isn't just growth, it's resilience through adaptation.
Right.
It is an ongoing, massive experiment in balancing deeply rooted, fiercely guarded regional and social identities with the requirements of a modern, unified national state.
So what does this all mean for you? It means that tracing India's path from 1947 to the present isn't about looking at a straight line of progress. It is fundamentally a story of constant, complex negotiation.
Yep.
It's a nation navigating the deep psychological scars of colonial engineering, utilizing blunt force economic planning to build an industrial base from scratch, and ultimately finding its greatest stability not in uniformity, but in the chaotic, necessary compromise of coalition politics.
Which leaves you with a deeply provocative thought to consider. We looked at how James Mill and the British census deliberately attempted to rigidly categorize and divide the Indian population to make them easier to rule, right?
Right.
Well, did that very colonial attempt to artificially force people into rigid blocks actually forge the fierce, organized regional and social identities that now serve as the primary counterbalance to authoritarianism?
Wow.
Is it possible that the messy, frustrating necessity of the common minimum program, the mechanism that forces sworn regional rivals to sit at a table and compromise just to survive, is actually the greatest safeguard of India's democracy?
It's a wild paradox to consider. The very lines painted on the floor by the British to keep the roommates forever divided might be the exact reason those roommates eventually had to learn how to negotiate, compromise, and ultimately run the house on their own terms. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history that shapes our present.